Welcome to Wrestling with History. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe as we continue to bring you the greatest stories in the history of wrestling. Early 1993 was a time when two eras were butting up against each other in the World Wrestling Federation. The old guard was still grasping on to what once was, as the new generation was finding its footing, seeking out their own path to rise to the top, and collateral damage is all but assured in the transition. Hulk Hogan had been away from the product for several months, circumventing controversy about his past steroid involvement and filming his next feature film, Mr. Nanny. The Ultimate Warrior had been fired, along with the British Bulldog a few months earlier, after issues with the new WWF drug policy. Ric Flair, who had won the WWF title twice the previous year, had claimed to be suffering bouts of vertigo and sought a return to WCW that was granted to him in a loser leaves WWF match against Mr. Perfect in early 1993. With this sudden exodus of top talent, Vince McMahon was faced with a serious dilemma. Would he chart a path forward to rebrand and rebuild the WWF with young new talent that was gathering momentum, or would his trust in their ability fall short and his old habits die hard, and return to the formula that had worked to lift his company onto a worldwide stage and generated tremendous revenue for himself? In the spring of 1993, those two realities would collide, and the fallout would create a seismic shift in the wrestling business once again. After 417 episodes of primetime wrestling, a new era of wrestling television was ushered in on January 11, 1993. Monday Night Raw made its debut from the Manhattan Center in New York City. It marked a move away from the enhancement talent, jobber, squash matches that were heavily featured on the syndicated shows like Primetime Wrestling and Superstars. Though it still had its fair share of those, it was also creating more compelling matchups as the company faced increasingly stronger competition from Ted Turner's WCW. The working title for the new program was Down, Dirty, Nitty Gritty Raw. McMahon was so adamant about the show having a less polished feel, he was repeatedly heard saying, "It has to be raw." It ended up just becoming the name of the show. Vince McMahon also wanted a more current events and live feel to the program that felt unscripted, highlighted talents, and brought the anything can happen in the World Wrestling Federation feel back to the air. As Primetime Wrestling's ratings hit the lowest in the series' history in the fourth quarter of 1992. While they wanted to do Raw live every Monday, the logistics starting out prevented that. With Raw airing from the Manhattan Center exclusively early on, the travel schedule would require some episodes to be recorded in advance. Raw was considered a TV taping, not a live event or a pay-per-view where the wrestlers could get a nice payday from the live gate. Instead, for Raw, many wrestlers were required to fly across country to appear, or come off a much more profitable tour to make the show. And their pay for all of this hassle? $25. The WWF standard rate of pay for a television taping in 1993. Bret Hart ended 1992 on a high note. He wrote in his book that he and his wife Julie celebrated during Christmas break what had been the best year of his life. He was the WWF Champion. He had good money coming in. His children were doing well, but he found himself in the same position as so many years prior. On Christmas Day, his bags packed, heading back out onto the road. But now he was carrying the gold around his waist. The spotlight was shining brighter than it ever had on the Hitman. On January 11th, in the first ever Monday Night Raw, Razor Ramon gave an interview with Vince McMahon. He talked about how he attacked Owen Hart and that there's nothing Bret Hart can do about it. A match between Bret and Razor for the WWF title is then hyped for the Royal Rumble. Bret Hart, the current champion, was not featured in a significant segment or match on this debut episode of Raw. On the January 16th episode of Superstars, Bret Hart opens the show with a shadowy, backstage promo segment stating that winning the WWF title was the greatest accomplishment in his life. He knew he'd have to face all challengers, but he never thought he'd face one from the bottom of the barrel like Razor Ramon. And after Razor's attack on Owen, Bret forecasted that at the Royal Rumble, the excellence of execution will execute you. Bret was then interviewed on the January 18th episode of Raw. The champion said he can handle insults directed at him, but when people bring in his family, when they jump his brother, kicking and beating him like a dog, or talking about slapping his 78-year-old father, he doesn't have any respect for them. Bret again called Razor the lowest form of scum in the World Wrestling Federation. He stated that he's known as the greatest technician and wrestler in the world, and that the belt he holds proves it. But at the Royal Rumble, Bret is going to throw all that out and kick Ramon unconscious, beating him from one end of the ring to the other, redeem the Hart family name, and show why he is the WWF Champion. This era is pure nostalgia for early 90s wrestling fans, with vignettes, character-driven in-ring interviews, and everything moving quickly during these one-hour shows. Early Raws are also noted for Mean Gene making appearances from the studio in front of a green screen, hyping the matches and throwing to video packages. He was selling everything coming up on the calendar as slickly as he could at all times. On January 24th, the 6th annual Royal Rumble aired live from Arco Arena in Sacramento, California in front of 16,000 high-energy spectators. The WWF title match took place on the undercard, with the Royal Rumble match itself filling the main event spot. After Razor entered, they cut to a backstage interview with Bret where he said this was now personal because this was about blood. A cool shot of Bret standing in his ring gear backstage as his music played was featured. Bret wore all pink leather ring jacket, pink singlet, his classic pink wraparound shades, and pink and white boots. Bret is shown coming through the curtain from the gorilla position. Then the cameras cut to the fans giving him a strong ovation in Sacramento that night as he headed towards the ring. Bret said Razor Ramon, Scott Hall, was still very green at the time, and he was afraid that taking the Razor's edge may break his neck if he took the finisher during the match. Fellow top WWF wrestler at the time, Ric Flair, had said Hall was overrated. What is he known for? Standing in the ring while Shawn Michaels wrestled the ladder? Bret didn't level anywhere near that harsh of criticism against Razor, but Flair has a habit of making these strong comments then walking them back in future interviews. Bret won a strong matchup that made Razor look competitive in the world title contest, winning with the sharpshooter after Razor kicked out of a pinning combination that Gorilla Monsoon enthusiastically announced as a bow and arrow. Yokozuna entered at number 27 and went on to win the Royal Rumble by last eliminating Macho Man Randy Savage. This would be the first Royal Rumble to feature the stipulation that the winner would go on to face the WWF Champion at that year's Wrestlemania. Savage instinctively went for a pin after landing his patented top rope elbow drop. Yoko pressed him off to kick out. Savage sold it like he'd been shot out of a cannon and launched over the top rope, taking a bump to the floor, causing his elimination. Yokozuna had debuted on August 13, 1992 in the WWF. Rodney and Hawaii had previously wrestled in various territories as well as New Japan, even winning the IWGP tag titles with Big Van Vader as his partner. The impressive size and athleticism of Rodney had caught the attention of the WWF executives. They sought a way to utilize him differently than the Head Shrinkers, current WWF tag team and real-life relatives of Rodney. They wanted something outside the trope of the traditional Samoan wild man wrestler. Sergeant Slaughter came up with a concept for a sumo wrestler, putting Rodney's hair in a bun, putting him in red tights, and pairing him with legendary Japanese manager Mr. Fuji. His pay-per-view debut occurred when he literally squashed Virgil at the Survivor Series that fall. His Rumble victory marked one of the fastest ascents to the top of the card in WWF history. On the February 1st episode of Monday Night Raw, as the WWF began to make a more concerted effort to establish Bret as the face of the company, a clip was shown of Bret giving a $100,000 check to charity, and he was also featured in an Ico Pro commercial that night as well. IcoPro was a line of supplements owned by Vince McMahon that began as a spin-off to his World Bodybuilding Federation. The supplements never caught on, in part because they received unfavorable reviews and the WBF would collapse after a disastrously undersold second pay-per-view event. On Superstars February 6, Hacksaw Jim Duggan would challenge Yokozuna. It was being billed as USA vs. Japan. Not a traditional match, but a contest to see if Duggan could get Yoko off his feet. Hacksaw Jim Duggan would get in his famous three-point stance, harkening back to his days on the gridiron, then charge forward at Yokozuna, and after a couple tries did manage to get the massive Yokozuna to take a flat back bump in the center of the ring. This enraged Yokozuna, and as the crowd chanted USA, USA, Duggan was blinded with a handful of sumo salt to the eyes. Jerry the King Lawler said on commentary, "He's fixing to get Pearl Harbored." Yoko then dropped 4 bonsais onto the chest of Duggan, with the last one coming as the US flag was draped over Duggan's motionless body. Then Yoko sat on the flag on top of him for a prolonged period of time. This angle would generate mainstream attention, as a California-based League of Asian American artists would protest the depiction of the evil Japanese villain using language and themes that revived anti-Japanese sentiments of World War II. The company would also have a lawsuit filed against it by a separate individual who wanted the WWF to formally apologize for its disrespectful use of the American flag during the segment. Hacksaw Jim Duggan was then stretchered away, blood dripping from his mouth from internal injuries, and he wouldn't be seen on television again for over 4 months. McMahon remarked on commentary as Jim Duggan was wheeled to the back, "A hush has fallen over the crowd. No one can believe what they've seen." In spite of the controversy, and possibly because of it, the company was getting Yokozuna over, with clear audience reactions and intrigue, and genuine heel heat. As the WWF was getting Yokozuna over as a monster heel to go against their babyface champion, it was the Hulk Hogan playbook all over again, but little did everyone know just how attached McMahon still was to the Hulkamania style. On the February 22nd episode of Raw, a clip of Vince McMahon conducting a sit-down interview with Hulk Hogan is aired. Hulk is asked about his upcoming announcement on Monday Night Raw, and that fans are hoping that he will announce his return to the company. Hogan had taken a leave of absence from WWF the previous year when Dr. George Zaharian was charged with providing steroids and hormones to professional wrestlers, including Hulk Hogan and even Vince McMahon himself. Hogan had appeared on Arsenio Hall's show and refuted these claims, saying he had only ever taken male hormones to treat muscle-related injuries less than a handful of times in his career. This would be proven false. Hogan had been caught in a lie that had damaged his public reputation. Hogan would say in the sit-down with McMahon, "The future of Hulkamania is so exciting I don't even know how to express myself." Hulk Hogan then talked about the past of Hulkamania, and that in the past year away from wrestling, he's reflected on the mistakes he's made in his life. The steroid scandal facing the WWF was still casting a shadow over the business, and Hogan was clearly alluding to that. He said, "Hulk Hogan wants to be the leader of the 90s. It's not just do as I say, it's now do as I do." Hogan then came down from his Mount Sinai and gave his 5 demandments. Train, say your prayers, eat your vitamins, believe in yourself, and believe in Hulk Hogan. He finished the interview stating, "Wait till my Hulkamaniacs hear what I have to say on Monday Night Raw." Vince had reached out to Hogan to gauge his interest in a possible return and what Hogan wanted to do when he came back. Hogan said he wanted to come back to get the next guy to replace him over. Vince loved the idea. And then he found out who the guy was to replace him in Hogan's mind. Not current champion Bret Hart, not up-and-comer Shawn Michaels, not The Undertaker. Hogan wanted to help elevate Brutus the Barber Beefcake to take his standing as the face of the company. Brutus the Barber Beefcake had just been involved in an angle where Money Inc., Irwin R. Shyster and Ted DiBiase's tag team, had nailed the surgically repaired face of Brutus. The Hulk Hogan special announcement took place as Vince McMahon stood in the ring on Raw and introduced Hogan. As Hulk came to the ring, he was noticeably leaner than his previous run. The suspicion was that he'd been training clean in light of the Dr. Zaharian scandal and the possible indictment of Vince McMahon. Vince began, "Okay, Hulk, tell us what we want to hear." Hogan talked about Money Inc.'s attack on Brutus the Barber Beefcake. Brutus had just returned from a real-life parasailing accident that had shattered his face and nearly ended his career. Hogan thanked the big man upstairs for being there with Brutus through the accident. And what could have been a real nightmare had Money Inc. destroyed his face all over again. He then thanked Jimmy Hart. Hogan then said that he is back in the WWF and he wants to right this wrong with Money Inc. And he wants his friend till the end, Brutus the Bionic Barber Beefcake, by his side. Jimmy Hart was then introduced and it was announced that he will be managing Hogan and Beefcake. Jimmy cut his patented high-energy promo, claiming Hulk and Brutus will be the best tag team ever. He said he'll be taking his vitamins and Money Inc. better start saying their prayers. Hogan dubbed the new trio the Mega Maniacs. The show opened with Bret picking up a win against Fatu, the future Attitude Era star Rikishi, using a sharpshooter in a 10-minute contest. Later in the episode, Money Inc. gave an interview and challenged the Mega Maniacs to a match at Wrestlemania 9, and they'd even put the tag team titles on the line for it. IRS said he would be the next to get hit in the face with his briefcase. He then corrected himself. Briefcase? No. Beefcase. The March 8th Raw opened with Hogan, Beefcake, and Hart cutting a promo accepting the match against Money Inc. for Mania. Then, in a riff on the Saturday Night Live cold open, they proclaimed together, "From New York, it's Monday night. Raw!" The promo was followed immediately with a tag team win by Money Inc. over Tito Santana and Virgil. This feud was now getting the most airtime, seeming to take precedence over Bret Hart versus Yokozuna for the title. Bret delivered a promo that night putting over Yokozuna as a force of nature, having squashed everyone in front of him in his short time in the Federation. And while he respects Yokozuna, he knows Yokozuna and Fuji have no respect for him. Fuji responded to Hart in a backstage segment with Yokozuna, with Yoko delivering one-word responses to punctuate each of Fuji's sentences, most notably, "Bonsai." Bret wrote that he had seen Hogan before the show that night, that Hogan had been making appearances for the WWF the previous couple months, but hadn't fully rejoined the company. Bret went up to Hogan to shake his hand, but according to Bret, Hogan only gave him a dismissive nod and wouldn't shake Bret's hand. With Bret now being the champ, Hogan viewed him as a threat. During this time, WWF business was dipping across the board, but Bret and Yoko together were still proving to be a strong draw on top of the card. They would wrestle at the main event of a house show at the Arrowhead Pond in Anaheim, California, selling over 15,000 tickets. Raw would hit the road on March 15th as it emanated live from Poughkeepsie, New York, 2 hours north of New York City. This was the first broadcast of Raw away from the Manhattan Center. It featured Gorilla Monsoon and Bobby Heenan on commentary with "Not Vince McMahon." Gorilla stated that the blizzard of 1993 had thrown a monkey wrench into Raw, with many superstars having difficulty making it to the show that night. Gorilla Monsoon then said that McMahon was in New York City with Randy Savage receiving an award from a leukemia foundation. March to WrestleMania aired on the USA Network. It had been recorded on March 7th and aired on March 28th, exactly 1 week before WrestleMania 9. The show began with a clip of the WWF title match contract signing from the previous episode of Wrestling Challenge. Yokozuna had hit Bret with a table, chopped him in the throat, then landed a bonsai drop. Bret would struggle to his feet after the bonsai, but getting a huge reaction from the crowd. The big selling point was that Bret was the first man to ever endure a bonsai drop, then have the fortitude to return back to his feet after. Yokozuna picked up a huge win over Macho Man Randy Savage on the March to WrestleMania show when Fuji hit Savage with his Japanese flagpole as Savage climbed up to the top rope. Yoko would then hit a snug belly-to-belly and cover Savage for the 1-2-3. When Yoko went for a post-match banzai, Savage moved, then knocked Yoko out of the ring. Randy Savage was protected in defeat, but the strong push to get Yokozuna as a vicious, unstoppable heel was now well underway. That night, Money Inc. picked up another win. Then the Mega Maniacs, led by Hogan, delivered an interview conducted by Mean Gene. Brutus was wearing a face mask to protect his surgically repaired face and to sell the briefcase shot from Money Inc. Hogan then talked about emptying the chlorine out of the pool at Caesar's Palace, filling it with salt water, with mermaids and sea urchins, then adding hammerhead sharks to the mix and putting the WWF World Tag Team titles in their mouths. It was a fantastical, meandering promo that called back to a former era, one that some romanticized and others looked forward to getting away from. WrestleMania 9 kicked off from Caesar's Palace in Las Vegas, Nevada on April 4th, 1993. It was the first outdoor WrestleMania, but it wasn't hosted in a baseball or football stadium as future outdoor manias would come to be. It was hosted in a makeshift stadium that was set up in a parking lot on Caesar's property, with generic football bleachers brought in to create the temporary structure. Caesars used this to host major boxing events, and WWE was willing to get in on the action and use the setup itself. The WWE wouldn't host another stadium pay-per-view event in Las Vegas until 28 years later at Allegiant Stadium for SummerSlam 2021. The Mega Maniacs wrestled Money Inc. in an 18-minute match that featured both Hogan and Beefcake selling for Money Inc. after they cheated to gain advantages, then giving the other the hot tag to make a comeback. Hogan came to the ring that afternoon with a black eye, with bandaging tape covering up stitches on his eyebrow and bruising throughout the left side of his face. The announcers claimed that Hogan had been cheap shot by Money Inc. in an attempt to take him out, but Hogan was still determined to wrestle that night. The true story, insofar as Hulk Hogan would tell it, is that Hogan had returned from a 10-day UK tour, and when he got home he invited Macho Man, WWF crew member Ellis, and Beefcake over to his house in Clearwater Beach, Florida. Hogan then jumped a wave in a jet ski. The air he got ended up propelling his body in front of the jet ski, and as he tried to duck under the water, his life jacket pulled him back up to the surface, just in time to be struck in the face by his own watercraft, shattering his orbital socket, creating a gash that would require numerous stitches. Hogan claims he was knocked unconscious, laying face down in the ocean, and would have drowned had Ellis not acted quickly and pulled him out from the water. Hogan claims Vince wanted him off the card, but Hulk insisted if he could pass a physical, he would wrestle, and he ended up doing so. Brutus the Barber came to the ring with a thick, neon-painted plastic mask covering his face on account of his own maritime misadventure, and to sell the briefcase strike he'd been hit with previously on Raw. Money Inc. tried to leave the arena, but were then informed if they were counted out, they'd lose the tag titles. Bobby Heenan quipped on commentary, "So we're just making the rules up as we go?" Ultimately, Jimmy Hart would reverse his jacket, showing referee stripes, and count a double pinfall for the Mega Maniacs while the referee was knocked out. But a second referee would arrive, awarding Money Inc. the victory via disqualification. Hogan would then open IRS's briefcase and begin handing fistfuls of real cash from it to the shocked crowd. This would not be the last we'd see of Hulk Hogan that night. The day before Mania, Vince had called Bret up to his suite for a meeting. He told Bret there was a change of plans. Vince wanted Bret to drop the title to Yoko, then Yoko would immediately drop the belt to Hulk, with Hulk having come out to the aid of Bret after the main event. Bret was gutted, but he told Vince, "I'll do whatever you need me to do." Vince chirped back, "Don't get bitter now, I still have big plans for you." This contradicted what Bret claimed Vince had told him originally, that he was a long-term champion, that Vince was thinking of keeping the belt on him for 6 or 7 years, and that he considered recreating the years-long title run of Bruno Sammartino with the Hitman as his top babyface, and that whatever Hulk Hogan did, it would have no bearing on how Vince handled Bret. Bret felt that the dip in attendance during 1993 had more to do with the ring boy sex controversy as well as the steroid scandal surrounding the Federation than his ability to carry the company, which he hadn't had the full push to establish himself within the business as the top star that Hogan had been afforded. Bret laid out the match in advance and went over everything repeatedly with Yokozuna, even practicing whether he could get the sharpshooter applied to the quarter-ton Samoan's legs. Building it slowly as to not gas out Yokozuna, Bret claims Yokozuna called for the match to go home, or reach the finish, early because he was exhausted and couldn't continue. Bruce Pritchard would claim that they got word to the referee to wrap it up early because they didn't want to go over their pay-per-view time slot. Nevertheless, Bret locked in the sharpshooter. Mr. Fuji, surprised at the quick ending and struggling to find the foreign object he'd hid in his robe, then threw a handful of salt, or in reality baby powder, into the eyes of the champion as the referee was preoccupied checking on whether Yokozuna was going to submit. Bret stumbled back, releasing the hold. Yoko then covered him for the 1-2-3 and was crowned the new WWF Champion. Then an on-screen ally of Bret's showed up to check on him, Hulk Hogan. And in one of the all-time strategic blunders in Wrestlemania history, Mr. Fuji then challenged Hulk to an immediate title match. Yoko held Hogan by the arms as Fuji went for a handful of powder to his eyes. Hulk ducked and Yokozuna was struck with it instead. Hogan then delivered a right hand to Fuji, then clotheslined Yoko to the mat and followed it up with his legendary leg drop, then covered him for the pinfall victory. Fincus Maximus, as Howard Finkel was being called that night at Caesar's Palace, proclaimed, "And new World Wrestling Federation Champion, Hulk Hogan." Real American blasted over the speakers and the fans let out a tremendous pop, excited with the immediate fix to the cheating heel's unscrupulous victory. While Bret in character had shouted, "Go get him, Hulk," inside he was seething. He felt Hulk had been promised the belt all along since agreeing to return, and Vince had gone back to what had always worked for him in the past. For this was no longer the mid-80s height of Hulkamania. Sure, the surprise finish and the hidden nostalgia would create a buzz, but when the dust settled, with Hogan making limited appearances, fans would question the move and reject what they'd been fed. At least that's what Bret felt would happen. The 6-month-long build of Yokozuna was felt by some to have been ruined by the quick loss to Hogan, dropping the title to him in the post-match hullabaloo. Jim Ross, who made his WWF debut that night on commentary, spoke later on the issue. Doing a quick finish like that, it makes it look like a fluke, that Hogan got lucky and Yoko could still be kept strong in spite of the loss. In the locker room after the match, Hulk would greet Bret with a much different demeanor than that night at TV tapings just a month earlier. Hogan proclaimed, "Thank you, brother. I won't forget it, and I'll be happy to return the favor." Bret looked him in the eye and answered back, "I'm going to remember that, Terry." Keeping the Hulkster to his word would prove to be a task even outside the abilities of the excellence of execution, as Hogan would hold the title for less than 3 months, not following through on his promise to Bret, but instead dropping it back in a flash to Yokozuna at the King of the Ring. This made for Hogan's 9th consecutive WrestleMania appearance, having been featured in every iteration of the event until this point, but it would also be his last appearance until 9 years later. The following year, in 1994, Hogan would sign a massive contract with World Championship Wrestling that would shift the entire landscape of the industry, and force Vince to get serious about finding a path forward that did not include Hulkamania for the first time.